Namaskar and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our show Perspective, where we bring you detailed analysis of key national and international issues. Today, we're going to talk about CPC's plenary, that is Communist Party of China's plenary. Now, the sixth plenary session of 19th Communist Party of China's Central Committee was held this week in Beijing, where a resolution was adopted on major achievements and historical experience of the CPC's 100 years of endeavors. Now, unlike Deng's resolution, which acknowledged past mistakes under Mao, such as the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution that led to millions of deaths, this plenary's resolution painted an entirely rosy picture of the party's 100-year history. Experts say that the significance of the resolution goes beyond the past and is not merely about the legacies of party leaders, but it seeks to establish Xi Jinping among the party's tallest leaders since Mao and Deng. Xi's second five-year term as the Communist Party leader ends next year, but he is expected to seek an almost unprecedented third term and beyond at the 20th Party Congress in late 2022. Now, the communique released after the plenary hailed Xi Jinping's leadership in responding to the pandemic, defended the crackdown in Hong Kong, where a sweeping national security law was passed last year, and firmly opposed separatist activities seeking Taiwan's independence, but made no reference to unification, which has for long been a goal of the Communist Party's leadership. In today's episode of Perspective, we will discuss and analyze proceedings of the CPC plenary and what it seeks to convey both to the domestic constituency within China and outside China as well to other nations. And for more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of experts. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with, we have with us Professor Shrikant Kondapalli here in the studio. He's a professor with the Center for East Asian Studies at JNU. We're also joined by former Mr. Dilip Sinha, and Pramitpal Chaudhary is also joining us, former Foreign Affairs Editor with Hindustan Times. Welcome, all of you gentlemen. Let me begin with you, Professor Kondapalli, since you're a well-known and renowned expert on China. Let's first start by understanding the significance of this plenary, that's one, and the significance of the words of the resolution, or rather the wording, because there are a lot of similarities or a lot of points which have been highlighted by the experts vis-a-vis how this indicates towards Xi Jinping, sort of focusing his stronghold as far as CPC and China is concerned.
Well, obviously, this is a very important meeting that the Communist Party had held. Generally, they have 7 plenums. The 6th plenum is reserved for party ideology and party bureaucratic, policies that they need to adopt. So it's more of the Communist Party's, essence that they wish to discuss. So the 384 full or alternative members of the Central Committee, who met from 8 till yesterday, they had discussed this draft resolution. So we do not know what exactly the resolution has been so far, because that has not been put up in the public domain. Mm-hmm. But there is a mention that this was discussed in the plenary session. And so we have a communique that was issued, not the resolution,
indeed,
but the communique, number one. So we do not know what exactly has transpired in all this. Number two is the previous 6th plenary sessions in 1945 and in 1981 have become famous because they became turn points for the party, Communist Party. And also the 2016 6th plenum also had, because that decided about Xi Jinping as the core leader. And hence there is the emphasis on the third term, fourth term, or whatever terms extension for President Xi Jinping, here General Secretary Xi Jinping. Mm-hmm. So that's one. The third aspect is that there is a lot of mention of Xi Jinping thought and praising of Xi Jinping, very explicit terms, mentioning, for instance, he is the anchor, that Xi Jinping thought will be the guiding thought, or he is the founding person for this thought process, and so on and so forth. They also reiterated the socialism with Chinese characteristics under the new era, which is what Xi Jinping had done since 2012.
Okay.
And the number of times Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao were referred to is only once, but Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping were referred to extensively. In fact, Mao was referred to more than Deng Xiaoping. That's because the Xi Jinping government wanted to probably reiterate the Mao Zedong's contributions rather than Deng Xiaoping's. Deng Xiaoping brought in reform and made China rich, but it also provided a lot of inequalities, which Xi Jinping is trying to fix through common prosperity debate, or as we saw the fintechs, edtechs, the rebooting of the Chinese economy through the 14th Five-Year Plan. But in terms of the significance of this, the most important, there is no mention anywhere of the third term or fourth term in this. So we could probably see more skirmishes among the political factions within the Communist Party, that is Communist Youth League, the New Zhejiang Army of the Xi Jinping, or the Jiang Zemin's faction, because he was referred to only once in this, and he controls a lot of, in fact, the billionaires and trillionaires all have the Jiang Zemin's influence. So there is a likelihood of intensive politicking in the run-up to the 20th Party Congress.
So it's not that easy when we're talking about, the third term for Xi Jinping there. But it looks like, as you're also pointing out quite clearly, that the focus vis-a-vis this particular plenary has been on Xi Jinping. And Mr. Sinha, would you agree there that this was all about praising, General Secretary Xi Jinping or, President Xi Jinping?
Well, yes, it is singing paeans to Xi Jinping and elevating him to the status almost on par with Mao Zedong. But it also endorses the leadership of Xi Jinping. He's now running into his 10th year. And normally by this time, by the tradition of the Communist Party since Mao Zedong, the successor is named, or at least he becomes clear, and a smooth transition has been taking place for the last 3 or 4 transitions between the old leadership and the new leadership. And this has been one of the strengths of the Communist Party in China, that although it's a dictatorship, within the party there is a general trend towards change in leadership, so that new blood comes in and the party kind of renews itself. But in this declaration, not the declaration, the communique, as the professor mentioned, the communique talks about upholding the core position of Xi Jinping on the Central Committee and the party as a whole, which means that running into his 10th year, the party is endorsing his continuing, staying in the core position. This, I think, is an endorsement of his re-election for a third term. As we know, the limits on the third term were removed by Xi Jinping a few years ago. So nothing stops him now from being endorsed, short, of course, of any kind of skullduggery within the party, which may happen, one doesn't know. But this will be the first time that since Mao, the party will be moving towards extending the term of its supreme leader beyond 2 terms for 10 years approximately.
Pramit, what are your views, assessment of what transpired there at the plenary? We know through that communique which has come out. As Mr. Sinha is pointing out, and as Professor Kondapalli was also saying, it looks like it's Xi Jinping all the way.
One assumes that he has amassed an enormous degree of power, especially in terms of official positions. His crackdown on dissent, both outside and inside the party. He's been able to take on the richest people, richest businessmen of China, which has been a very popular move. But he's also been able to sideline or marginalize almost anybody in the party who could be potentially a rival. And I should say that in the run-up to the present plenary, if I'm correct, 7 provincial party heads were removed and changed. And his own Shanxi clique, the province that he comes from or lived for the early part of his party life, he's been able to put them in almost every major position. Even the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, the officer corps has been purged at the beginning, right from the beginning, and repeatedly so. So yes, we assume that Xi will face no major obstacles in being able to ensure that the Party Congress next year gives him a third term. Having said that, there's also a bit of, there's some evidence, it's really hard to tell how strong it is, of small signs of dissent within the party that continue to pop up. One example was Wen Jiabao, the previous premier. He wrote an obituary for his mother, which was interpreted as basically an attack on Xi Jinping and the degree with which he had closed down China. It was immediately, of course, purged from Chinese websites and so on. But there were a couple of studies have argued that there have been at least 10 similar, those smaller incidents of protest or dissent from within the party in public fora of some variety or another. This indicates that it's not a 100%, it's not a sealed and shut case for Xi yet. I don't expect him to be stopped from having his third term. But he could still face a few speeches or otherwise coming out against him and criticizing him for a number of things. One of which, of course, as I've mentioned, the dissent issue. The second is that China will be facing some economic problems, of which he can probably blame a large number on COVID. But also the fact that he's taken on a large number of, made a lot of enemies. In his attempts both to reform the economy as well as consolidate power. And I think on the external side, there is some unhappiness that he has pushed China into a situation of almost inevitable confrontation, not necessarily military, with the United States.
Well, we'll come to that external part as well, and that is where I'd like to bring you in here, Professor Kondapalli. Obviously, you and Pramit seems to think on the similar lines when we're talking about some sort of resistance there, or the path to Xi Jinping having a third term might not be that clear as it seems. But that's the domestic part, and domestic politics will keep on playing. But let's also look at what does this, this communique or the indications coming in from this particular plenary vis-a-vis the international community, not only countries like United States, but also from our perspective, from India's perspective, because one part of China's policy, which has been bothering most of the other countries, including us, is Xi Jinping's or China's expansionist agenda.
Indeed, the plenum communique doesn't mention much about the foreign policy dimension. It mentions, of course, that the last 1 year has been very turbulent for China, number one. Number two, it mentions about balancing between security and economy. Number three, it mentions about Taiwan, Macau, Hong Kong. Number four, it mentions about major power diplomacy that China is entering into in relation to Russia, United States, European Union, Japan, and so on. It doesn't mention about neighborhood policy, but nevertheless, it also has implications because of the background of the land border law or the security related. Because he mentions about the PLA or the armed forces and the modernization to be continued, etc. But in the larger formulation, the plenum suggests to, number one, standing up during Mao, and becoming rich under Deng Xiaoping, and he suggests to the forward policy of becoming strong. Here, strong means basically about national security considerations or pushing Chinese envelope onto the neighborhood. And so obviously there are frictions here substantially that are going to come up if there is an extension for Xi Jinping in the next 20th Party Congress. So those are various dimensions. And Mr. Sinha, if we have to look at it from the global perspective or from the world's perspective as to what is happening or what is transpiring within China, because as you're pointing out, this is the penultimate, plenary session before the new leader is decided, somebody is going to take over. No clear indications there
Of course, there are no clear indications to the fact that Xi Jinping will, take over for the third term as well. But these apart, and the kind of, the words which have been used vis-a-vis Hong Kong, vis-a-vis Taiwan, as Professor Kondapalli is pointing out, what is it that we should understand, or the world should understand? They're already, China is already in the midst of various kind of confrontations, be it the South China Sea, the trade war, or the border skirmishes.
The communique that's been released is long on rhetoric, but it's quite bland, and it's very short on facts, on data. So, for example, they talk about environmental pollution, but there is no commitment given out. It talks about the long-standing fight against corruption. But then that's what Xi Jinping had talked about 9 years ago when he gave his speech at the plenary in 2012. He's not talked about foreign policy in terms of the way we would look at foreign policy. He looks at Taiwan. He mentioned about Taiwan's independence not being acceptable, so they have mentioned Taiwan. And the communique mentions that there is an unstable and insecure situations in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. It says that Hong Kong should be ruled by patriots. So these are what the communique treats as internal matters of China. So strictly speaking, on foreign policy matters, the communique doesn't really mention anything. So we have to go essentially by the general tenor of the communique. And one of the points that the communique makes is that parties should avoid making catastrophic mistakes on fundamental issues, which means that Xi Jinping is trying to downplay his own re-election. So he was trying to downplay and say that this is all business as usual. There is no revolution taking place. Everything is calm and quiet, and the people should follow the party, and the party should maintain party discipline. So his style of getting the third term would be to try and downplay the importance and the revolutionary character of the fact that he'll be the first leader after Mao Zedong to do a third term. Mm-hmm. But apart from that, whatever else he does by way of repression, as Pramit mentioned, would be done quietly inside the country. So one hopes that the internal dissent continues to keep him busy internally, which keeps him out of the aggressive policy that he has otherwise been following outside the country.
Okay. Pramit, your views there on the external part. You were, in your first response, you're mentioning how, the trade war with the United States is something which might not be looked at very positively within China by some factions. And the fact that, China has been committed by Xi Jinping on various fronts, vis-a-vis various sort of confrontations.
Yeah, we've seen, I would argue, on the foreign front in the past couple of years, partly because of the pandemic, but generally there's been, I think, a reassessment of some of the more ambitious projects that China launched. One of them was the Belt Road Initiative, because that is now, should we say, has been shrunk in terms of its ambitions. But China has moved into areas like technology standards, for example, which in many ways are more defining for the future. It's accepted that the decoupling strategy that the United States has adopted of slowly breaking off supply chain linkages to China, at least in high-end technology sectors, is now basically inevitable. And its own 5-year plan indicates that it wants to now, it'll basically follow the same thing.
Okay.
But like other countries are finding in terms of decoupling from China, China is finding it's rather difficult to decouple from the rest of the world. Its failed economic trade sanctions against Australia were an example. It's not been able to stop the revival and strengthening of the Quad, for example, or AUKUS, a new military triangle in its south, or Japan announcing that it will see the defense of Taiwan as part of its national interest. So a number of fronts, it's faced a few foreign policy problems. I wouldn't say they're catastrophically bad, but the sense that China has bitten off a little bit more than it wants to chew right now is there. It's not even happy with the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and has privately been complaining to everybody about the American haste in pulling out and leaving the problem, in effect, in China's backyard. Um, Taiwan, however, remains crucially important to Xi Jinping, I would argue, because it was one of the key reasons that he was able to succeed as the present Chinese leader, defeating Li Keqiang and others, because he came out very strongly and argued that I will ensure the unification of China. And so that remains something that he cannot really walk away from. I mean, no Chinese leader actually can. But I think he has to be a little bit more aggressive about that. And I would expect that has now become a major flashpoint that he doesn't know what to do about. So on the foreign policy front, I see a certain moderation in some areas, but in this one key area, and I would argue territorially also with India, territory, if you wish, is now something that he cannot really, that has become his personal foreign policy issue. And it's one area that he finds it very difficult to walk back.
Professor Konapalli, your views there on these two parts, before we bring this discussion to an end. One, the unification policy, as Pramit is pointing out, it is going to be really difficult for Xi Jinping to even, give an impression that he is not committed to that, because he won, or rather, became the leader on that pledge itself, that the unification will take place. Also, from India's perspective, as Pramit was pointing out, the border policy, which China has now adopted, also seemingly is Xi Jinping's idea.
Yes, on the Taiwan-related issue, the Chinese have this historical syndrome called Li Hongqiang. Li Hongqiang in 1894 gave up the Korean Peninsula, the Taiwan, and others to Japanese. So it's a nightmare for any Communist Party leader in China to be called as a Li Hongqiang. So everybody would say, all leaders would say, we will, there is a Chinese phrase, Omen Yiting Yao Chefang Taiwan. That is, we will liberate Taiwan. It's a very strong word, liberation, like Tibet, like other areas. So this is a very strong plank they have, and at least what they could do is to restrict the Taiwanese independence rather than allowing it to, take military action on Taiwan. Because military action on Taiwan would be costly for China itself, including its own rise, because of the Taiwanese investment in mainland China, 2 million Taiwanese living in China, or the kind of semiconductor industries and other things that the Taiwanese have pumped into China's rise, ironically. So on Taiwan, it's a very complicated issue. There is no way that they can actually gobble up Taiwan. So that is one. Second, the major problems that the plenum identifies is, one of the problems is territorial integrity. And that's where we come in terms of what is happening post-Galwan, Galwan and post-Galwan. And here, the setting up of the well-off society villages, including Lungchu, where the Pentagon paper had mentioned about, or the 200 well-off villages, well-off society villages that they have actually put up on the LAC, line of actual control. I think this is going to be of a huge company for us for a long time to come, and that's where we need to also match up in this format.
So quite a lot to read and understand out there from that communique. Thank you so much, Professor Konapalli, Pramit, as well as Mr. Sinha, for sharing your views and insights. As our experts were pointing out, this seemingly was a clear indication that Xi Jinping is here to stay, but no formal announcements, of course, neither for his successor nor for him to continue. For that, we'll have to wait for at least another 10 to 12 months, that is towards the end of October, when the next plenary will happen. But this plenary's indications are pretty much clear that Xi Jinping remains the man in command, the man in control, and we will keep a close watch on the developments from here onwards. I'll bring you more detailed analysis. Till then, keep watching Sansad Television. Thank you.